He once graded Harvard papers. That same winter, he was digging through trash cans for food. If you had told him 10 years earlier that this would be his life, he would have laughed you out of the lecture hall. But grief does not ask permission before it destroys a man, and addiction does not care how many degrees hang on his wall. This is the story of Professor Daniel Whitfield, a man who taught the brightest minds in the country, and who ended up sleeping under a bridge with nothing but a torn blanket and a mind that refused to stop thinking. Stay with me to the end, because what happens to him is not what you expect, and if this story moves you even a little, hit subscribe before we go any further, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Daniel Whitfield was the kind of professor students waited years to study under. He taught economic theory at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, the kind of institution where the buildings are older than the nation itself, and the ivy on the walls has been growing since before anyone alive was born. He had 2 doctorates, a shelf full of published papers, and a reputation for being the toughest grader in the department. Students feared his red pen more than they feared their final exams. He was known for staying in his office until midnight, poring over essays with the same intensity a surgeon brings to an operating table, because to him, every paper was a young mind trying to become something, and he refused to let a single one of them slide by with lazy thinking. Colleagues respected him. Deans consulted him. He had turned down offers from other universities because he believed his students deserved consistency, deserved a mentor who would not abandon them halfway through their education for a bigger paycheck elsewhere. By every outward measure, Daniel Whitfield had built a life most people spend their entire careers chasing and never catch. But there was a version of Daniel that his students never saw. A version that existed only after the lecture halls emptied and the office lights went dark. He had a wife named Claire and a son named Michael, and for years they were the quiet center that made all of his professional intensity possible. He worked long hours because he knew he was coming home to something worth working for. Claire used to joke that she married a man who fell in love with numbers before he fell in love with her, and Daniel used to laugh and tell her that numbers never left dishes in the sink or forgot anniversaries. But she did neither of those things either, and that was the joke, the gentle kind of teasing that only exists between 2 people who have built something real together. Michael was 12 years old, obsessed with astronomy, the kind of kid who asked questions his father could not always answer, which delighted Daniel more than anything, because it reminded him why he had fallen in love with learning in the first place. On weekends, the 3 of them would drive out past the city lights just to look at the stars, Michael narrating facts about distant galaxies, while his parents listened, half amused and half in awe of their son's endless curiosity. It was, by any honest account, a good life. Not a perfect one, but a good one, built slowly and carefully over years of ordinary effort. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early November, that life ended in the space of a single phone call. Claire and Michael had been driving home from a school science fair, one of those small, proud evenings where a 12-year-old shows off a homemade model of the solar system to a gymnasium full of parents. A truck driver, exhausted after a double shift and fighting to stay awake, drifted across the center line. The collision was over in less than 2 seconds. Daniel was still at his office when the call came, grading papers under a desk lamp, a stack of blue books in front of him that he would never finish grading, because nothing after that phone call would ever feel important again. He does not remember driving to the hospital. He remembers a nurse's face, and the particular kind of silence that exists in hospital hallways when the news is the worst kind of news, a silence that presses down on a person's chest harder than any physical weight ever could. Claire did not survive the crash. Michael held on for 11 days in intensive care before his small body simply could not fight anymore. Daniel sat beside that hospital bed for every one of those 11 days, holding his son's hand, talking to him about stars even though the boy could not respond, because some quiet, desperate part of him believed that if he just kept talking about galaxies and constellations, Michael might decide to stay. He did not stay. And when the machines finally went silent, something in Daniel went silent along with them, something that no lecture, no doctorate, no accolade would ever fully switch back on. Grief researchers will tell you that the loss of a child changes the architecture of a person's brain, that it is one of the few kinds of pain the human mind is never fully equipped to process. Daniel did not need a research paper to tell him that. He felt it happening in real time, felt himself becoming a stranger inside his own skull. He returned to teaching 3 weeks after the funeral because the university offered him time, and because sitting alone in a house that still smelled like his wife's perfume and still had his son's telescope pointed out the bedroom window was somehow worse than standing in front of 100 students and pretending to be a functioning human being. For a while, the performance held. He lectured. He graded. He nodded at colleagues in the hallway. But underneath the performance, something was rotting. Quietly, the way a beam rots inside a wall long before the house actually collapses. It started with sleep, or rather, the total absence of it. Daniel had not slept more than 2 hours a night since the funeral, and a doctor, meaning well, prescribed him something strong to help him rest. It helped at first the way a bandage helps a wound that actually needs stitches. But grief is patient and cruel, and it does not go away just because a pill quiets it for a few hours. Daniel found himself needing more of the medication to get the same relief, and when the prescription ran out faster than the doctor intended, he found other ways to get more. This is the part of the story most people do not want to hear, because it is uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit that addiction rarely begins with a bad decision made by a bad person. It begins, more often than not, with a good person in unbearable pain who is simply trying to survive one more night. Within a year, the man who once terrified students with his red pen could barely keep his hands steady enough to hold one. He missed classes. He missed meetings. He began drinking alongside the pills, telling himself it was only to take the edge off, only until he could sleep through a night without seeing his son's face on a hospital pillow. The university, out of loyalty and genuine concern, gave him more chances than most institutions ever would. They offered him leave. They offered him counseling. They offered him a path back. But addiction does not respond to offers, no matter how generous, and Daniel kept slipping further from every hand extended toward him, not because he did not want help, but because some broken part of him no longer believed he deserved it. The university let him go 18 months after the accident, not out of cruelty, but because a man who cannot show up cannot be allowed to keep grading the futures of other people's children. Daniel understood this, even in his fog, even as it destroyed the last structure holding his life together. He sold the house within the year, because he could not afford it without a salary, and because every room in it held a memory sharp enough to cut him open. He moved into an apartment, then a smaller apartment, then a motel room paid for week to week, and at each step downward, he told himself this was temporary, that he would climb back out once he felt strong enough. Not understanding that the version of himself capable of climbing had been buried in a hospital plot beside his wife and son. By the third winter after the accident, Daniel Whitfield, former professor, published economist, a man who had once been flown across the country to consult on national policy, was living on the street. He kept this fact from almost everyone who had known him, because shame is its own kind of prison, one that convinces a person they deserve to suffer alone rather than reach out and risk being seen in their worst state. He found shelter under a highway overpass on the edge of the city, in a small encampment of other people the world had quietly stopped looking at. He learned, the way people in that situation are forced to learn, which restaurants threw out usable food at closing time, which trash bins behind grocery stores were worth checking, which corners offered the least wind at night. The man who had once debated economic policy with senators was now calculating, with the same analytical mind, the most efficient route between 3 dumpsters before the morning trucks came to empty them. It is worth pausing here to say something plainly, because this story only means something if we are honest about it. This can happen to almost anyone. It is not a story about a weak man or a foolish man. It is a story about how thin the line actually is between a stable life and a shattered one. How a single phone call, a single tragedy, a single untreated wound can unravel even the most accomplished person alive. If this part of the story is landing with you, If you know someone who has struggled the way Daniel struggled, or if this is simply moving you, drop the word free in the comments, because later in this story we will tell you exactly where his path led, and there is something in it that might help someone you know. Daniel spent nearly 2 years living on the streets. His hands, once steady enough to write equations across a chalkboard without hesitation, grew rough and scarred. His face, once clean-shaven and photographed for university brochures, disappeared behind a beard he no longer had the means or the will to manage. People walked past him the way people walk past anyone on the street, eyes forward, pace unbroken, the unconscious agreement most of society makes to not really see the people it has failed. He stopped introducing himself with his name. He stopped, most days, speaking at all. The brilliant, demanding professor, who once could not let a single flawed argument pass without correction, had become a man who no longer corrected anyone, because he no longer believed his voice carried any weight worth hearing. And then, on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon in late autumn, a woman named Elena Ruiz sat down on the curb near his usual spot outside a downtown library, and everything began, slowly, impossibly, to change. Elena was not a social worker, not a therapist, not anyone with a formal reason to be there. She was a former high school teacher who had recently retired and volunteered twice a week, handing out sandwiches and coffee to people living near the library steps. Not because a program told her to, but because she believed, in her own quiet way. That dignity was something you gave people through attention, not just charity. She had learned, over years of doing this work, that most people on the street had simply stopped being asked questions, real questions, the kind that assumed they had a mind worth engaging. So instead of just handing Daniel a sandwich and moving on, as most passers-by did, she sat down next to him and asked what he was reading. He was holding a torn, water-damaged paperback he had found in a donation bin, a book on macroeconomic theory, of all things, the kind of dense academic text most people would not touch voluntarily. Daniel almost did not answer her. He had trained himself, over 2 years, to expect nothing from conversations with strangers except pity or fear. But something about the specificity of her question, the fact that she asked about the book rather than about his situation, cracked something open in him that had been sealed shut for a long time. He answered her. And then, almost against his own will, he began explaining a concept from the book, correcting an error in the author's reasoning with the same precise, demanding clarity he once used on graduate students, and Elena, who had no formal economics training at all, sat there completely captivated, because she recognized something in the way he spoke. She recognized a mind that had not died, only gone into hiding. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She never asked him directly how he ended up there, understanding instinctively that trust has to be earned in small increments, not demanded all at once. Instead, she kept bringing him books, sometimes economics, sometimes history, sometimes novels, and she kept asking him what he thought of them, treating him, every single time, like a mind worth consulting rather than a problem to be solved. It took nearly 4 months before Daniel told her his real name, and even longer before he told her he had once been a professor, because saying it out loud made the distance between who he had been and who he had become feel unbearably vast. But Elena did not flinch when he told her. She simply nodded and said that it explained a great deal. And then she asked him what he thought young people today misunderstood most about economics, as though his opinion still mattered, as though the years on the street had not erased his right to have one. It was Elena who eventually connected him with a recovery program run out of a small nonprofit near the edge of downtown, one that specialized not in generic rehabilitation, but in helping people rebuild an actual identity alongside their sobriety, understanding that recovery without purpose tends to collapse under its own weight. Daniel resisted at first. Part of him had grown almost comfortable inside his own ruin, the way a person can grow comfortable inside any prison after enough time, simply because the alternative, hope, is terrifying in its own way. Because hope means the possibility of failing again. But Elena kept showing up, kept asking questions, kept treating him like a man with a future, rather than a man defined entirely by his past, and eventually, that consistency did what pity never could. It gave him a reason to try. The recovery process was not fast, and it was not clean, and anyone who tells this kind of story as a smooth, linear climb from rock bottom to redemption is not telling the truth. Daniel relapsed twice in his first year of treatment. He missed appointments. There were nights he disappeared entirely, and Elena, true to the quiet stubbornness that defined her, simply kept showing up at the library steps on Thursdays, kept leaving books at the shelter, where he sometimes stayed, kept refusing to give up on him even when he had more than once given up on himself. Recovery, real recovery, rarely looks like the moment in a movie where the music swells and everything suddenly gets better. It looks like 1,000 small, unremarkable choices to try again, made by a person who has every reason to stop trying, sustained often not by their own strength alone, but by someone else's stubborn belief that they are still worth the effort. 18 months into his recovery, staying sober and living in transitional housing arranged through the nonprofit, Daniel began volunteering, at first informally, tutoring other residents who were working toward their GED. Word spread quickly through the small community that the quiet, thoughtful man in the transitional housing program had once been a university professor, and soon people were seeking him out specifically, not out of curiosity, but because he was, simply, an extraordinary teacher. Patient in a way few tutors are. Because he understood, more than most, what it felt like to have your intelligence buried under circumstances that had nothing to do with your actual capability. A former colleague from his university days, someone who had lost touch with him years earlier and assumed, like most people, that he had either recovered on his own or had not survived at all, happened to see him teaching a free evening class at the community center Elena had helped connect him to. The recognition was immediate, and so, eventually, was the conversation that followed. One that led to a quiet meeting with the dean who had once been forced to let him go. There was no dramatic reinstatement, no cinematic return to a lecture hall filled with cheering students. Real life rarely offers those kinds of endings. What Daniel was offered instead was smaller and, in its own way, more meaningful. A position teaching part-time at a community college, working primarily with students who were the first in their families to attend college, many of whom were juggling jobs and family responsibilities that made the traditional academic path feel impossible. It was not Harvard. It did not come with prestige or a six-figure salary. But it came with purpose, and purpose, Daniel had learned the hard way, was the one thing money and prestige could never actually provide on their own. Today, Daniel Whitfield teaches 3 courses a semester at that community college, and he still volunteers on Thursday evenings at the same shelter program where his own recovery began. Because he understands, better than almost anyone, that the difference between a person who disappears into the street and a person who finds their way back is very rarely willpower alone. It is very often one person who refuses to stop seeing them as human. He keeps a photograph of Claire and Michael on his desk, not hidden away out of grief, but displayed openly, because he has come to understand that honoring their memory does not mean punishing himself forever for surviving them. He speaks. When students ask, honestly about what happened to him, not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten them, but as proof that a person's worst chapter is never actually the end of their story, no matter how convincingly it might feel that way in the middle of living it. Elena Ruiz still volunteers at the library steps every Thursday, still asks strangers what they are reading, still believes, with the same quiet stubbornness that once saved a broken professor's life, that dignity begins with a single honest question asked to someone the rest of the world has stopped asking anything at all. She and Daniel remain close friends to this day, and he has said, more than once, that she did not save him by offering him a program or a solution, but simply by treating him, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, like a mind still worth knowing. There is a lesson buried inside Daniel Whitfield's story, one that goes beyond addiction, beyond grief, beyond even the particular tragedy that started his collapse. It is this: Brilliance does not protect a person from suffering, and suffering does not erase a person's brilliance. The two can exist, terribly, inside the same human being at the same time, and the only thing that ever seems to bridge the distance between a person's worst moment and their next chapter is another person willing to sit down beside them and ask a real question. If this story affected you the way it affected everyone who worked on telling it, subscribe now so you do not miss the next one. And if you believe, like we do, that no one's story ends at their lowest point, type free in the comments below. Because we have something for you there. And because somewhere, right now, there is a Daniel Whitfield sitting on a curb, waiting for someone to simply ask what he is reading.